right, good morning. We're going to go ahead and get started. This is Bonnie McFarland, and I'm here with our team this morning, Adrian Balcazar, Evan Bartelheim, Rachel Garcia, Jeannie Keith, and Amy Tomomatsu. And I think Evan just posted in the chat that the slides are posted today on our website, and also any handouts that we'll be referring to. And in addition, the recording will be posted after the meeting. So that will all be available to you if you have something, if you have to leave early, or if you missed something, want to hear it again. So today, it's February already, and every month we think, is there anything new that is coming for our folks? And there always is something new on your plate. So today, these are the topics we're going to be talking about. First of all, we want to look at some reminders for your school plan for mid-year, what needs to be happening mid-year for school plans, and review that. We're going to take a look at the state audit guide and the updates that are coming on that and how they impact your lives. We'll be looking at the new coronavirus relief funds that were authorized by by Congress and are posted and will be coming out soon. We'll review some of the Equitable Services requirements. We will be doing a full workshop on that later in the spring, but we want to give you a heads up on those requirements because it's consultation time again. Once again, we'll be looking at FPM and how you can organize effectively for federal program monitoring. We'll review the local indicators. There have been a lot of questions and confusion on that. And then we'll have an LCAP update, particularly reviewing some of the things we had at our recent training for those of you who aren't able to attend that, or that's just a small part of your work. So as usual, we'll take your questions in the chat and respond to them with a Q&A. We want to make sure we give you accurate and information and review your questions so we can give them to you in written form so you have them clearly and there's no confusion. So put your questions in the chat and we'll get that Q&A out to you as soon as possible. All right. Also, this is the link where you can find information from our previous meetings, where the Q&A is posted if you haven't received it, or if you want to look at previous ones. And this is the link to our director's website. You'll find everything you need there. So let's move on and take a look at school plan mid-year reminders. And what we want to do is review some of the tasks that should be taking place at this time related to school plans. Sometimes we only talk about school plans at the beginning of the year and the end of the year. It's like, write your school plan and we'll see you in June. And there are really some important requirements that need to take place throughout the year. And it's also important to provide ongoing support to schools during implementation. And in some cases, there are legal requirements to do so. So we'll take a look at some of those today. So number one, we'll start with is something that many of you are working on right now, and that's your consolidated application. And you're currently doing that. And one of the pages in the consolidated application is the school allocation page. And that page requires you to indicate how much funds are allocated to each of your schools. So your schools should have been ranked and received their initial preliminary allocation at the beginning of the year. But now you get a final allocation, and I say final in quotes because sometimes those amounts keep changing throughout the year, but this is what's documented in the consolidated application. The amount posted there that is allocated to each school needs to be aligned to what's in the school level plans. So once you've allocated the funds in the application, you need to make sure that they match. And the reason for this is to provide transparency and accountability for Title I funds. In other words, if someone were to look and see an amount allocated to a school in the consolidated application and then look at a school plan and see less than that, they'd wonder what happened to the money and where does that go? And so this is reviewed through the federal program monitoring process. Also want to note what this means, that the budgeted amounts in the school plans for Title I schools need to match both the overall budgeted amount. So often schools have an overall budget and you can see the total amount budgeted, but that also needs to match the amount budgeted for each of the individual activities. And we found districts that have been out of compliance because their total budgeted amount doesn't match what the individual amounts are when you add them up based on the line items and the actions. So if you have an amount for each action, if you go and add up all those actions, that should total what's in the consolidated application. So not just a lump sum, but it should all add up. All right. So what needs to happen to make that happen? There's a lot that needs to happen to make sure those match. First of all, you need to determine what those final allocations are based on that CONAP school allocation page. So you need to allocate the funds, and however you've done that allocation, that needs to be done first. Then you need to notify schools in writing of the final funding amounts. There's a requirement in law that schools be notified, and you have documentation that schools have been notified of that final funding amount. Then you need to look at those amounts as allocated in the CONAP and see if they're different from the amounts in the school plans. If it remained the same, then not a problem. You don't need to make any revisions. But if they differ from what schools currently have in their budgeted amounts in their school plans, then you need to verify that schools have a school site council meeting scheduled within the next few weeks. It should be done in a timely manner, and verify that revision of the school plan is on the agenda for the next upcoming school site council meeting. Then you need to make sure that the final revised budgets for each Title I funded school match the amount budgeted in the consolidated application. So make sure there's a match for that. Then if the revisions result in what's called a material change, you need to schedule a date for your local board or governing body to approve the revised plan. And code says that plans must go back to the board for approval if there's a material change. Material change isn't defined in law. Generally, it looks at, in some cases, a 10% line item can be considered a material change, but essentially it means a change that would cause someone to ask a question. What happened here? This is what I thought was planned. It would raise questions or make a difference in decision making. So sometimes that is determined by your local board. Some boards actually have provided guidance to LEAs as to this is what we want to see if there's this much of a change or a significant change. Okay. Some districts just go back as a matter of course when they revise school plans mid-year. So those are all things that need to happen to get that aligned. And again, that is a frequent FPM finding that, well, when you have a review, whenever it is, they'll look at the CONAP, they'll look at the plan at the time the CONAP came out and make sure there's a match. All right, so next, what else needs to happen? Well, there are also requirements, excuse me, and these are from the compensatory education instrument, requirements for evaluation of school plan services. Both state and federal law include requirements for the evaluation of school plans. This is frequently a missing step in the process for school plan development is the evaluation. And there's been increased focus by CDE on monitoring this process, evaluation. So the last few years, we've seen them really focus on where's your evaluation of the plan. For school-wide programs, this includes a process for not just evaluating the effectiveness, but also for monitoring the implementation of the plan. So next slide, we'll take a look at at targeted programs. So for targeted programs, there's also a requirement for evaluation. It's a little bit different. It's more particularly focused on the students because in a targeted program, you're identifying specific students who are eligible for services based on the district's multiple objective academically related criteria. So once you've identified those students, then you need to take a look at how those students are progressing and what you're doing to support them. So let's take a look at what this means. Okay. So for school-wide programs, there needs to be a process to review the degree to which the plan is being implemented as planned. There also needs to be an annual evaluation based on academic outcomes. And in addition, the plan needs to look at the effectiveness of the plan based on the progress of students, and particularly those students who are most at risk of not meeting state standards, so your lowest achieving students. For targeted programs, there needs to be an ongoing process for evaluating the progress of students who are receiving the services, and then making adjustments to provide additional support to those students if they're not making progress. So both of them have evaluation components. So let's look at what needs to happen. Okay. So number one, LEAs need to ensure that there's a process for monitoring implementation of the school plan. And some questions to ask are the activities being implemented as described? Are they being implemented in a timely manner? If they aren't being implemented, how are the funds that were allocated for those services being used? And if there were changes made, what was the reason for the change? And is that documented in the school plan? Another very practical question is the school on track to spend their Title I funds by the end of the school year and avoid excessive carryover? So some questions that need to be asked now, and one of the major issues that sort of causes school plans not to be effective is not so much that maybe the goals are off or the activities are inappropriate. It just doesn't happen. Things don't occur, or they don't occur in a timely manner. And if schools aren't doing what they said they were going to do, then that impacts students. So this is a critical piece. And for districts that have, or LEAs with comprehensive support and improvement schools, it's a legal requirement. So for schools identified for CSI, the LEA is responsible for monitoring implementation and effectiveness. So it's not just, it's very specific for CSI schools. And in fact, that process was described in the CSI prompts that the LEAs submitted in December. So this is what LEAs were asked to do: describe how the LEA will monitor and evaluate implementation and effectiveness of the plan to support student and school improvement. If you have CSI schools, someone in your district responded to that prompt, so you need to go back and look at it. And what did you say? And is that actually happening for your CSI schools? All right, so next we're going to look at what else needs to happen to measure effectiveness, the evaluation of effectiveness part. And first of all, academic measures need to be identified to measure the effect of the program in improving academic achievement. It's focused on academic achievement, so what measures are you going to use? So first question is, what state assessment measures, if any, are available to measure academic achievement? And then what local assessment measures will be used? So what local assessment measures do LEAs have to measure their outcomes? And do the outcomes in the school plan identify and define these measures? So you should go back and look at the school plans, and do the outcomes say, this is what the outcome we expect, and here's how we'll measure it. If that's in the school plan, then that's what you're going to use, or you're going to take a look and see, how are we going to measure effectiveness of the program? And then the next question is, how are schools going to measure the progress of low achieving students toward meeting state standards? And how are they operating their targeted, if they're operating a targeted assistance program, how are they monitoring the progress of identified students? And what program adjustments are made when students aren't showing progress? So let's take a look at some questions to ask regarding this. So first of all, schools need to determine how they're going to measure progress for low achieving students toward meeting state standards. Number one, you need to determine how low achieving students are identified in the school-wide program. Who are they? Who do you consider your low? Who should you be focusing on? What measures did you use? What baseline data is available to measure progress? If you're going to measure progress, you have to show where a student started. What do you have? What did you do at the beginning of the year to identify students who are struggling and have data on that? And then determine how the expectations for achievement are defined in your outcomes in the plan. What is it that the school expects students to achieve? And that's what you should be measuring. For targeted assistance schools, again, two parts: monitoring the progress of those identified students, so it's very specific to those individual students, and making adjustments based on the results of that progress. So first of all, as an LEA, you should be verifying that the school is maintaining a list of students identified for services. That's a requirement, to have a list of who your students are that you're serving. And then you need to verify that the school is actually using the LEA's multiple objective academic criteria to identify those students. Are they following those criteria? Then you need to verify some sort of ongoing assessment of student progress for those identified students. So what's in place? If you're targeting those students, what's the school doing to ensure they are making progress, not just at the end of the year, but throughout the year? And then you need to determine what changes are made if students aren't being effective if the services aren't being effective in improving achievement for those students. So how are you measuring the progress of students that are identified, and what's the process for making changes? And is that written down somewhere? How is that? What is that process? Is it part of the system under which a school operates? Okay, so another next area to be looking at right now is, whoops, that should say 21, 22. It's really hard to get those years quite right. 21, 22 is next year, and that's what we should begin the process of school plan development for the 2021, 22 school year. This is when this should be happening. First of all, you need to look at a date for board approval of school plans, and then provide schools with a timeline for school plan development and submission of the drafts for LEA review. We encourage districts to use a planning cycle that has approved ready for the beginning of the school year and not mid-year approval. But your call as a district when those plans are approved. But in this way, you'll have them aligned with your LCAP and other planning processes. So what's the line? Then you need to review your CalPADS data from last year and see if there's going to be any changes to Title I and ranking. So if you have some schools that are lower schools that are on the cusp of being eligible, you want to make sure those schools will still be eligible. And you can do that by looking at your data right now, see if you had significant drops in your low income numbers on your CalPADS report. Then determine if any site plans, if they're planning significant changes in the school plan that are going to result in the elimination of certificated positions. So if you have schools that are using Title I funds for certificated salaries, then and they're looking, as they look at their planning process, they don't think that's the most appropriate use for the coming year. You need to be aware of that, and you need to notify Human Resources well before that March 15th notification deadline, so they can look at reassignments or possibly eliminating positions. So that's an important piece. We find sometimes schools feel they have to just keep a program, an employee on, because there's no option for them once they've funded an employee, even if that's not effective in improving achievement. And often if they work with you, there's a possibility that person could be working in another position, or you can make changes, but you need to know it ahead of time. Then you need to provide schools with an estimate of funding. And people always are saying, well, how can they plan? We don't have funding. Well, for Title I, you can assume that schools would receive a minimum of 15% less than what they received this year. In most cases, districts can assume they're getting essentially the same amount, because Title I has a hold harmless requirement. And that means that schools, depending on your poverty level, are held harmless from their prior year's funding at 85, 90, or 95%. So a 15% cut is generally the worst unless there's some drastic thing going on. And the sort of the rumors we're hearing are that there is no intention of cutting Title I. In fact, it could be increased in the coming year. So for safe purposes, you can provide them with an estimate of current year or 15% less than this year for planning purposes. And then when you get the allocations posted, you can adjust those numbers. And remember, it's a plan and you can start planning. Most plans aren't so tight that a slight change in the funding is going to make a significant difference. So that's all that needs to happen. Those steps need to be in place for school planning. Finally, the last thing, but not least, that needs to happen is again required in education code. It says that the superintendent of the district must review school plans, okay, and that's submitted by 64001. So that's the school plan for student achievement, and to ensure that specific actions in the LCAP are consistent with the strategies in school plans submitted. So let's take a look at what that means. What that means, first of all, the LCAP is a district plan, but of course, most of the actions and services take place at school sites. So districts need to understand the needs of school sites when they're developing the LCAP, and reviewing school plans provides a picture of the needs and priorities that exist in your schools. The LCAP should align with and support and not duplicate at school level services. So that takes some coordination, and this is part of that process. So what needs to happen is aligning school plan, first of all, aligning school plan and LCAP development timelines. And this is another reason why we encourage school plans to be on a spring approval process. Because if schools are developing their plans and the district's developing their LCAP, they can work together to identify common needs at school sites through the school planning process. You also need to keep schools informed of what services might be provided through the actions in the LCAP, and this allows school site councils to provide better planning and decision making. Because when they know what's being provided through supplemental and concentration funds, then they can know what additional funds, what they can do with their Title I funds to supplement and support those services. So you don't want them duplicating things. If they know what the district's putting in the LCAP, then it helps the school with their planning process. So to do that, one thing you need to do is provide training to both district and school staff to understand the difference in the purpose of LCFF and federal ESSA programs. So first of all, we have LCFF-based funds, and that's supporting all students and student groups in the 8 state priority areas. So that's kind of forms the basis of your planning. Then you have the LCFF Increase to Improve Services requirement, which means you're providing additional support for 3 groups of students: low-income students, foster youth, English learners, as compared to services for all students. And that's based on the needs, conditions, and circumstances of those students. So the needs of a low-income student are not necessarily the same as the needs of an academically low-achieving student, because not all low-income students are low-achieving, but they do face hurdles. The same with foster youth. So you need to look at the needs, conditions, and circumstances of each of those groups. Then you have Title I, which has an academic focus, whereas LCFF is much broader, and your supplemental services can be broader than academic. This is academic support. It's at school sites based on the school plan, and it's about closing achievement gaps. So it has a very specific purpose. Then you have Title II, professional development, and that is to support the LEA's professional development program, which again may be funded through your LCF base and your Increase and Improve Services. And this fund is for all students, but you need to prioritize low performing, your CSI, ATSI schools, and your high poverty schools. And then finally, Title III, English language development and academic support specifically for your English learners, and also includes professional development, parent engagement activities to support English learners. All this needs to be supplemental to state, local, and other federally funded services. Helping district and schools understand these different funding sources and the purpose of each will again support them in the planning process. So a lot of things to take place here during this time mid-year. Again, schools, we need to support them throughout the year to ensure those plans are effective and not just at the beginning and the end of year. All right. I think I'm going to turn it over to Amy now to take a look at the audit guide.
Thank you, Bonnie. Yes, next we're going to share some information related to the audit guide. If we move on to the next slide. So depending on the structure of the LEA and the responsibilities of the State and Federal Programs Director or State and Federal Programs Administrators, the annual audit may or may not be something that you are involved in. Since the audit supplement for this year will have more changes than usual as a result of the pandemic, we thought we would bring this topic to you today. The audit guide is developed each year by the State Controller's Office in consultation with the Department of Finance and the CDE, and it contains the required annual fiscal and compliance requirements for school districts, county offices, and other LEAs. The documents reviewed and could be amended by the Education Audit Appeals Panel. You might see that abbreviated as EAAP, and it's adopted each year by July 1st. And if there are any additional revisions, of which there are quite a number this year, the supplement will be adopted by March 1st of the fiscal year. There's a 3-member panel on this Education Audit Appeals Panel, and it contains 1 designee each from FCMAT, which is the Fiscal Crisis Management Assistance Team, 1 member from the Department of Finance, and also a designee from the Superintendent of Public Instruction. You can find a copy of the audit guide on the Education Audit Appeals Panel's website. And that's what this screenshot is here on the, it's a screenshot of the homepage. And from there, you can navigate to the audit guide and download a copy. And there's a copy of the current year and prior year's audit guide downloadable in either Word or PDF from this website. Next slide. And this is just a screenshot of the State Controller's Office website. So that's separate from the EAAP website. On the State Controller's Office website, there are many links and resources about the audit report submission process and other guidelines. And also we have included on this slide, they provide a phone number and email for questions that they take in as well. Next slide. So a little bit about the audit timeline. This timeline of the audit can be a bit confusing at times, mostly because the process crosses over 2 different school years. So we want to try to show this visually by using the 2 different colors here on this slide, purple and black. So as I mentioned in that earlier slide, it's what you see in purple. The audit for the 2020-21 school year, that audit guide was released July 1st, 2020, so that you had the guide prior to the start of the new school year. And then since various pieces of legislation might affect requirements in the current year, so from that period when it was released in July, through the beginning fall semester. Since there's, especially this year because of the pandemic, there's going to be revisions of different pieces that might be amended or suspended. Those audit changes get released in what they call the supplement by March 1st. So March 1st, 2021 is the date we're all waiting for right now. So when new legislation is enacted, though even prior to that supplement coming out, so while we're waiting for it, the State Controller's Office will release what they call an Audit Advisory. So while we're waiting for the official document, they will post a Audit Advisory to address key changes. And that 2020-21 Audit Advisory is going to be something I'll share on the next slide. The audit is, so that's the purple, that's the current year, the 2020-21, with the release in July 1st and a supplement coming out March 1st. What's in black there though is showing you the crossover from the 2019-20. So the audit report from last school year is something that was due December 15th, 2020. So the audit process, once it's complete, the auditors prepare that report and submit it by December 15th. And then there's a process of review and potential correction that kind of bleeds into this current school year. You can see the dates of January 31st and March 15th. Now, one special note, looking at the audit advisory on the next slide, you'll see that they did allow for an extension for the usual December 15th deadline in this current school year. So we'll take a look at that on the next slide, please. So in the audit advisory that they released in October, they did provide for an extension of the deadline for the 19-20 school year's audit. Usually when that's due on December 15th, they instead provided for a deadline of March 31st, 2021. So there could be LEAs out there that are still in the process of finalizing that audit report for submission. Typically would have been done by December 15th, but they are providing till March 31st, 2021. And that exception was something that they shared in this audit advisory in October. In addition, they outlined other changes that were due to Senate Bill 98, so SB 98 and SB 820 in advance of the publication of the supplement that we're still waiting for to come out in March. So you can see those kind of bulleted here on this slide. Next page. Next, yes. And so the following table is a preview of the procedures that are going to be amended and also some procedures that will be suspended completely for the audit of the 2020-21 school year. As you can imagine, due to school closures and related activities impacted by those school closures, such as transportation and after-school programs, or the impacts due to distance learning, suspension of the LCAP, there's just a number of areas that had to be changed during the current year due to the current situation of the pandemic. So here's a bulleted list of the supplemental audit guide changes that you can anticipate seeing in that March 1st release. On the next slide, we have an example. This is a preview that CDE recently shared with us of changes that would be seeing in that March 1st supplement of the audit guide related to attendance and distance learning. So I want to provide this one example. We won't go too much into the detail, but as you can see, auditors will be looking for the written procedures for tiered re-engagement, selecting a sample of students, verifying that a certificate employee delivered the instruction, and they'll be tracing attendance records to those weekly engagement and daily participation records. And the auditors would also verify documentation of synchronous and asynchronous instruction. So that's atypical in terms of, when we have in-person regular instruction. So this is definitely an amendment to the audit guide specific to the current situation with the pandemic. On the next slide. So once the audit is complete, audit reports are filed each year by December 15th in normal circumstances. So the 2020-21 school year audit will be filed next school year by December 15th, 2021. The LEA submits the audit report to the CDE, the SCO, and the county office. Your independent auditors involved in the process of that submission. And there's a couple links here that describe the submission process further. And the entire review process typically concludes by the end of March. Next slide. And lastly, we're providing the screenshot of the contents included in the audit guide that you can download from that EAAP website. And as you can see, the guide is divided into sections based on the type of LEA. The first grouping is for LEAs other than charters, meaning those areas of audit do not apply to charters. And the second grouping is for all school districts, county offices, and charters. And the third and final grouping is a list of areas audited only for charter schools. And we've pulled out 5 areas shown here in red that might be of most interest to the state and federal programs administrators. For many of these areas, auditors will perform an audit based on a representative sample to achieve a high level of assurance. And that's typically based on the sample the sample size based on your ADA. So again, this audit process likely is very heavily involved in your business offices, but likely in coordination with state and federal programs offices. Last slide on the audit guide, wanted to provide a reference to the California Ed Code 41020, which is where you'll find the requirements around the audit and the details around the timelines. Auditors use the audit guide to perform the audit and prepare the audit report. And when you look at a completed audit report, you'll see the following 6 components identified on that slide, 1 through 6. Additional details around what's contained within each of those components is included in the audit guide. In addition, we want to also mention auditors will perform a federal component of the audit when an LEA meets the threshold of the Single Audit Act as part related to 2 CFR Part 200, Subpart F regarding audit requirements. LEAs are subject to a single audit or program-specific audit pursuant to 2 CFR 200-501A when the subrecipient spends $750,000 or more in federal awards during their fiscal year. And that portion of the audit is based on the OMB compliance supplement, and we provide the link here. That is, for anyone who might be wondering, different from FPM. This is largely the fiscal component as well as some program components, but this is the federal portion related to the Single Audit Act. So that's the end of the audit guide slides. We're going to move on to the next section, which is coronavirus relief update. And we want to give you a little bit of information about the new CRRSA Act. Next slide. So first, we're going to start with an update on the CARES Act. So LEAs completed the latest round of reporting in January for expenditures that went through December 2020. And statewide, it was reported that about 99% of the coronavirus relief funds has been expended or obligated, which makes sense considering that the deadline that we all had heard was December 31st, 2020. What we know now is that the new federal legislation, the CRRSA, actually extended the deadline another year at the federal level. So we're awaiting the state's decision to whether or not to amend the deadline here in California, which is currently in a proposed trailer bill. But if that's passed, the LEAs would then have till May 31st to expend or obligate the CRF funds with a certification that would be due March 1st. And then as for the other CARES Act fund, the ESSER 1, Gear 1, and the general fund portions, LEAs have reported fewer expenditures to this point, but these funds, as we know, are still available through June 30th. On the next slide, we'll move on to the new act. So they're calling this the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act of 2021, CRRSA. And on a recent state webinar, we heard that they are calling this Carissa, like the girl's name. So we have CARES and we have Carissa. And that was enacted on December 27th. And we also are seeing similar funding availability in terms of ESSER and GEAR. So we're going to start with ESSER. We're calling it ESSER 2. And the ESSER 2 fund for California is about $6.7 billion, with 90% going to LEAs. And to put that in perspective, we might have mentioned this last month as well. This is approximately 4 times more funding than the first round of ESSER funding. And preliminary allocations are now available on the CD website. So you see that link there on the slide. The allowable uses for ESSER 2 funding will be the same as that first round. And it's to address learning loss, and 2 specific additional areas were called out. And those would be for school facility repairs and improvements that would reduce the risk of virus transmission and exposure to health hazards, and inspection, testing, maintenance, repair, replacement, and upgrade projects to improve the indoor air quality in school facilities. Note also that the period of availability on these funds may also be used on pre-award costs dating back to March 13, 2020, which is the date on which the national emergency was declared. And different from ESSER 1, ESSER 2 has no equitable services requirement. Private schools will have an opportunity for funding through this round as a portion of Gear 2 funds, and we'll see that on the next slide. The Office of Elementary and Secondary Education has posted a document that provides a side-by-side comparison of differences and similarities between the ESSER 1 that was part of CARES and now the ESSER 2, which is part of CARISA, and that link is what you see in the final bullet on this slide. Next slide. So Gear 2. Gear 2 as part of CARISA, these funds will also be able to be used in the same manner as Gear 1, but we're still waiting for more information. We don't have the preliminary allocations posted to CD website yet. If you go to that website right now, it just says, please check back for future updates. Whereas ESSER and GEAR from the CARES Act had the equitable services requirement, ESSER 2 and GEAR 2 do not have an equitable services requirement. Instead, they did a special carve out in Gear 2 that will support eligible nonprofit private schools. So it's a separate reservation that will not go through school districts. And we're still waiting for further information on that, but we've provided a little bit there on the slide about it looks like they're going to have some sort of application process, and that information is forthcoming. And next slide, we have the CDE website, a screenshot for you. This is the new CARISA. See, I was going to say CRRSA, but I guess might as well say CARISA. The new website for the CARISA funding. They have also created a new email address for questions. So you may have in the past seen the CARES Act at cde.ca.gov, but they said that now that they have both CARES and CARISA, they changed it to edreliefffunds@cde.ca.gov. So that's now their new email for questions directly to CDE. And of course, you can also email us and we'll do our best to connect you with resources or answers to questions that you may have around this area. And that would conclude our section on the Coronavirus Relief Funds update. And we're going to move on next to Equitable Services, and I'll turn it over to Rachel. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Good morning, everyone. So as Amy mentioned, in this next section, we're going to be looking at equitable services. So we just have some reminders regarding equitable services and the consultation process with private schools. Next slide, please. So ESSA requires that access to equitable services be offered to eligible private school students, teachers, their families, and other educational personnel. However, participation by private schools is not required, and services provided must be allowable and comparable to those services provided to public school students and teachers participating in the program. The services can be different from those services provided to public school participants, as the services are based on the needs of private school students and teachers. And so services must also be evaluated for effectiveness. And it's also important to note that funds may not be provided directly to a private school. Next slide, please. So equitable services requirements apply to Title I, Parts A and C, Title II, Part A, Title III, Part A, Title IV, Part A and B, and also Project Serve. Additionally, equitable services provisions apply to the first round of ESSER and GEAR funds. And as Amy mentioned, there are no equitable services requirements for LEAs for the second round of ESSER and GEAR funds that LEAs will be receiving through the CARISA Act funds. Next slide, please. Only private schools that are nonprofit and have submitted an affidavit to the CDE may participate in equitable services. And there are two ways to access the list of eligible private schools. So the first link listed on the slide will take you to the CDE website where you can access a list of all private schools with an affidavit on file. The second link is for a searchable database that allows a search by district for the private schools within district boundaries. And a county password is required to access the database. The password for LA County is listed on the slide, and other counties must contact the CDE private school office for their specific county password. One important thing to keep in mind is that the CDE does not verify the accuracy of information submitted on the affidavits. The CDE expects districts to verify the accuracy of both student enrollment data and the tax exempt status through the consultation process. And this expectation is noted on the CONAP nonprofit private school consultation page that is submitted in the spring with the June submission. Next slide, please. So in terms of private school participation, there are different requirements for Title I than for Title II, III, and IV. So for Titles II, III, and IV, only nonprofit private schools within the district boundaries may participate. For Title I, nonprofit private schools both within and outside of the district boundaries may be eligible to participate because funding and services are based on the student's residence in a Title I school attendance area. So for example, if you have low-income students who live in Title I school attendance areas in your district, but attend nonprofit private schools outside of your district boundaries, these students would generate funds for Title I services. However, it's also important to remember that poverty does not determine who receives Title I services. To be eligible for Title I services, private school students must live in a Title I school attendance area and be failing or most at risk of failing based on multiple educationally related criteria that's agreed upon during the consultation process. Next slide, please. So consultation with nonprofit private schools is the responsibility of the LEA. So it's up to the LEA to initiate contact with private schools, and this must be done on an annual basis. The first step in the process is identifying those eligible private schools. And so as previously mentioned, only nonprofit private schools that have submitted an affidavit to CDE are eligible to participate. So you must contact the schools to make them aware of the programs and services for which their students and staff may be eligible. Again, for Title II, III, and IV, you would initiate contact with schools within your district boundaries. For Title I, you would contact private schools within your district boundaries, as well as private schools in adjoining districts to determine if they have eligible students enrolled. Most LEAs use an intent to participate letter or form to initiate this contact with private schools. And so the consultation process involves ongoing discussions and meetings between public and private school officials on key topics related to the provision of equitable services. And so the goal of consultation is agreement between the LEA and the private school officials on how to provide equitable and effective programs for private school students, teachers, and families. And the results of this agreement are reported to the Ombudsman through the spring CONAP submission. Next slide, please. So consultation with private school officials must be timely and meaningful. And it must also begin early enough to prepare for the next school year. And so that process should really be starting currently at this time. And so consultation must also occur during the design and the development of programs, and before the LEA makes any decision that can impact the participation of private school students, teachers, other educational personnel, and families. And it must also be ongoing throughout the year to ensure effective implementation as well as the evaluation of services. ESSA requires LEAs to address specific topics during consultation. And some of the required consultation topics are included on this slide, such as how the needs of private school students and teachers will be identified, what services will be offered, and how the services will be assessed. And keep in mind that a unilateral offer of services by an LEA with no opportunity for discussion or the application of a blanket rule is not adequate consultation. Effective consultation provides an opportunity for all parties to express their views and to have those views considered. Next slide, please. So here we see a screenshot of a sample private school consultation timeline from the CDE. If you take a look at February, you'll see that it is suggested that LEAs begin evaluating the current programs and services being provided, as well as begin the consultation process for next year's services. One other thing to keep in mind is that the CDE sometimes updates the private school database in March. So if you begin identifying the private schools eligible in January or February for services for the next school year, you'll also want to double check the CDE list after March to verify and see if any new schools were added to the list. Also, one thing that has recently changed that needs to be updated on this sample timeline is that it references the other ESEA nonprofit private school participation page being due with the June CONAP submission, and that was actually moved to the winter submission. But keep in mind that the nonprofit private school consultation page is still due during the June spring CONAP submission. Next slide, please. So here we see a screenshot of the CDE's intent to participate letter, and there's also a link to access this letter on the CDE webpage. And so most LEAs use some sort of intent to participate form to make that initial contact with private schools. And so the consultation process is initiated annually when the LEA reaches out to private schools to explain the intent and purposes of the applicable federal programs that their students and staff may be eligible to participate in. So it will be important to obtain a copy of the intent to participate form from each private school, whether or not they intend to participate in equitable services. And it's also important to include a deadline by which they need to respond. And so you would then begin the consultation process with the LEAs that have indicated their intent to participate. Next slide, please. So here is a screenshot of the CDE's written affirmation and also the link to access this document. And so LEAs are required to maintain in its records a written affirmation signed by each nonprofit private school to document that timely and meaningful consultation has occurred. The written affirmation must also include the option for private school officials to indicate their belief that timely and meaningful consultation has not occurred, or that the program design for private school participants is not equitable. And as previously mentioned, this information is then reported to the CDE through the nonprofit private school consultation page with the spring CONAP submission in June. And we have a screenshot of that on the next slide. So again, this is the screenshot of the nonprofit private school consultation page from the spring CONAP. And so you can see that LEAs are asked to indicate for each nonprofit private school if consultation has occurred, if consultation agreement was met, if a signed written affirmation is on file, and then also to provide a consultation code indicating the private school's belief that timely and meaningful consultation has or has not occurred, or if the program design is not equitable. Next slide, please. LEAs must maintain documentation that verifies that it has met the requirement for timely and meaningful consultation, as well as the provision of equitable services. And so this documentation includes intent to participate letters and forms, and other evidence of consultation attempts. And so you'll want to ensure that you have documentation of outreach to private schools. So for example, anything mailed to private school officials should be sent through certified mail, or anything emailed should be sent with red receipts so that you have that documentation. Other documentation that LEAs must maintain includes meeting agendas and minutes, any data collected to assess or evaluate services, service agreements or contracts with third-party providers, any monitoring or assessment tools, an inventory list of any materials, properties, or equipment that is purchased, and then also identification criteria for student eligibility for Title I services. Also, if the LEA disagrees with the private school officials on any topic that's discussed during consultation, the LEA is required to provide in writing to the private school officials the reason why the LEA disagrees. So you will need to maintain any written explanations of disagreement as well. Next slide. As a reminder, funds allocated for equitable services must be obligated in the fiscal year that funds are received so that eligible private school students, teachers, other educational personnel, and families receive the services that they're entitled to in a timely manner. This also reinforces the requirement that LEAs engage in timely consultation with private school officials so that services can begin at the same time as the public school program. Next slide. Another important reminder is that materials, equipment, and property purchased with funds for equitable services belongs to the LEA and should be collected at the end of the year. Materials or equipment purchased for equitable services are for use during that fiscal year. If private schools want to use the materials or equipment again the following year, then that's something that must be determined during the consultation process and also be based on the needs of the students. Equitable services must also be provided by either an employee of the LEA or through a third-party contractor. And it's important to note that the employment or contract must also be under the control and supervision of the LEA. Next slide, please. So here are just a few resources that we wanted to share. So the first is the link to the CDE Equitable Services Ombudsman webpage. And so this page also has a number of resources as well as links to other resource pages, such as frequently asked questions, and then links to the Equitable Services web pages for Title I, II, and III. We have also included the link to the updated Title I Equitable Services non-regulatory guidance from the US Department of Ed. And so this came out in October of 2019. And then also the link to the US Department of Ed webpage. And then lastly, we've included the link to the CARES Act Equitable Services FAQs on the CDE website. And that concludes my section. So now I will turn it over to Adrienne.
Good morning, everyone. FPM update. Happy Thursday to everyone. Today, we're going to take a holistic look at the federal programs in relation to the federal program monitoring reviews. So it first starts with the consolidated application, as Bonnie had mentioned earlier, and which allows the districts and charters that are completing right now the winter release. The CONAP is used by the CDE to distribute the categorical funds from the various federal programs throughout the state. And as mentioned before, it has two parts. It has the winter release and it has the spring release. The spring release, which is documents your participation in these programs. And as part of that, you accept the legal assurances affirming that the LEA will comply with all the legal requirements of each of those programs that they are participating in. So as you can see here, the screenshot on CDE's webpage, there are general assurances as well as other legal assurances that are unique to the specific federal programs that you are participating. So they have Title I, Title II, Title III, Title IV. Once you have indicated the federal programs that you are participating in, you must plan on how the district and site will implement the federal program. And so this is the LCAP Federal Addendum. And remember that the LCAP Federal Addendum is meant to supplement your LCAP, but it also meets the local educational agency plan provisions, that requirement of ESSA. So it's important, and that's why it's legally mandated. Just to note that the ESSA funds are supplemental to state funds, just as the LCAP Federal Addendum supplements your LCAP. You also have, on the site level, sites are responsible for developing a school plan for student achievement. ESSA requires that schools receiving Title I funds and are operating school-wide programs, or schools that have been identified for CSI, TSI, or ATSI must develop a school plan. And so the school plan is a one-year plan that is intended to be developed and approved before or during the school year for which the plan is being implemented. And again, it is a plan, meaning that it is to explain how the program is being implemented, and not at the end of a school year where that would be a report. So again, keep in mind the timeline and the planning that should be, we recommend it's taking place right now for next year's plan. So remember, implementing these federal programs is not a one-person show. It takes a team, and successful implementation requires a systemic approach. The policies and procedures that you have in place should support and facilitate all the legal requirements of the program, so that if you are selected for the FPM review, it is just a matter of collecting the evidence that you already have. The evidence is just a way that is you are required to have to validate the implementation of your program. So to establish a system, we recommend you can assign the FPM instruments to the relevant departments. You can create an FPM matrix that includes the instrument items and the contacts of who's in charge of each of those different programs. Also, we recommend that you create a Google Drive server folder storage system for the school sites as well as for the various departments. Next, you'll also want to create a timeline for evidence to be collected on an annual basis. When the instrument for that year comes out, you can create an evidence checklist or a collection sheet for each school, and also a spreadsheet for central office. So the FPM program instruments, you must keep in mind that they are a representation of federal or state laws, regulations, or controlling judicial decisions. So the program instrument is used by the CDE reviewers in an FPM to determine whether an LEA is meeting the requirements, and generally it's the minimum requirements of each program. Each program instrument also contains the appropriate legal citation. So if you are wanting more information about a specific item that's listed in the instrument, you have the reference there with the legal citations. Also, program instruments change from year to year, and where they may change, so to correspond with any changes in the federal or state laws or regulations or any controlling judicial decisions. So this is why it's important to include this aspect in your system, because you want to ensure that your district is up to date with any changes. And just like the UCP that had a change from the June instrument and they had a change in October, you want to make sure that you are, somebody is monitoring that, and us too. We always make sure that we bring that to your attention so that you have the information and you can disseminate it to the necessary people. Here is a sample of CDE puts out an FPM list of evidence, and so we will provide that on a link on our webpage. It is quite lengthy. It's about 300 pages when you see all the different program instruments included in this Excel spreadsheet. But the way it's organized is it has all of the evidence request, and the way you would entitle the document electronically, a description, and a little bit more instructions on the item, and then any other related item in the instrument that particular evidence would be aligned with. And so it has, the first tab is all of the programs, and then it has each of the other program by program instrument itself in isolation. So we will provide that for you. It's very handy if you're not using that. It definitely makes the next step, which is creating a checklist for the site and the district level. And so what has been successful is to kind of spread it out over the school year in terms of the evidence that the district would be collecting. And, again, it's aligned to the timeline of when things are completed or when things are in, the timeline of the process. So again, it's just a way of looking at breaking down and deconstructing the instrument for sites and for district program people. And so if you see here, it has the ABC. Those are the actual evidence. So in CE1, as you can see, the LEA parent and family engagement, there are 3 items of evidence that are requested for that. So it's a way of a checklist to make sure you have it and that you have, if there's any comments or anything, that you can state it there. With this team approach, again, knowing what is about FPM, and the next step would be to train the staff. So this needs to be part of your system, in that you are going to train your staff and on the program requirements, on your specific policies and procedures, on the updated for that year program instruments, and again, having those checklists and timelines of the required evidence so that they can embed that at the site level as well as at the district level in their day-to-day operations. Also, you may want to train your staff in uploading the documents, whether it's a Google, a server, or if you purchase a vendor folder system, you want to have specific training so that everyone knows how to do that. Also, you need to schedule regular meetings with program and site leads so that it's not you doing everything. You have other people that are assisting you in the process. And then the next step would be the monitor and support. So it's, once you go through this initial training, then the communication is vital, because again, it's not like FPM or the evidence or the implementation of your program is it doesn't just start at the beginning and then nobody talks about it again. It really needs to be ongoing communication. Email is good because that is your paper trail or your electronic trail. Also, it's good to check the Google or your server or whatever the operating system you are using to collect evidence, to take a look at that regularly. And also, what's really critical is to ensure that the items that are uploaded are the actual correct items and they are clearly addressing the evidence that's being requested. And then provide feedback. That needs to be part of your system. And because then if you can determine, such as like time accounting, if you see that perhaps a specific employee is not quite understanding how to, say, do the time and effort report, you can provide that additional technical assistance. And you can also provide additional resources if you see systemically that there's some areas that need to be addressed. And again, the importance of scheduling regularly time, with program and your site leads. So again, looking at this, the FPM process and the implementation of your federal programs is just something that should be, again, a team approach, systemic, so that it's not all reliant on one person, but the way that the LAA or the charter does business. So again, we wanted to, we want to bring this to light now as you are preparing for next year. You're kind of looking at what has happened this year and making sure that you move forward in a positive direction, so that if you are selected, it's just a matter of gathering all that evidence. And now I'm going to turn it over to Evan.
Thanks, Adrienne. So we've received a lot of questions recently about the local indicators, so we hope that an update might be timely and helpful. And in addition, as Bonnie was pointing out earlier when she's discussing the alignment of school plans with the LCAP, and as Adrienne was just talking about, having a team focus, we do think there's really an important role for state and federal program staff in the identification and collection of relevant data for the local indicators. So we'll go into that. So next slide, please. So as a reminder, the local indicators were developed to provide a measure of the LCFF priorities where data is not collected at the state level, and they allow LEAs to measure and report progress on these priorities using locally collected data. And I know it's hard to believe, but just a year ago, the state board revised the standards for the local indicators. And we shared at that time how significant the revision had changed the timeline for collecting and reporting the local indicators. But let's face it, it was probably not fully absorbed before our attention was refocused on things like pandemic and school closures. So it's good to kind of revisit the first of all those revisions. So the revisions changed a couple things. So the LEAs must annually measure their progress in meeting the requirements of each specific LCFF priority area. That was there before, but now they must report the results of the local indicators as part of a non-consent item at a regularly scheduled public board meeting in conjunction with the adoption of the LCAP. So that pushes up the collection reporting period. As you called before, it was strictly the latter date when they were being reported in the fall into the dashboard. And they do include then the report of the results into the dashboard using the state-approved self-reflection tools. And notably, one of the self-reflection tools changed substantially, the parent and family engagement, just prior to the state board changing. So we want to take a look at that too. The next slide, please. So, you know, as I mentioned, COVID came along, and before LEAs could really test drive this timeline, self-reflection tools, local indicators were suspended as a result of two separate actions. First, in March, the state received a federal waiver for the 1920 school year for the required reporting of assessment and accountability measures, which California has largely fulfilled through the dashboard. And then in June, the passage of Senate Bill 98 sealed the deal by suspending the requirement in state law for the publication of the dashboard. So it was twofold. We were first allowed to waive, and then the state amended the rules. However, that was last year. And to address the first common misunderstanding that we've heard, this year, the federal and state requirements are back in place. So LEA should be identifying and collecting data for both the local indicators as well as local measures. And I want to make a distinction here. These are similar sounding terms. So I think because they've gotten thrown around, people get confused. The local indicators refer to the measures of progress on state priorities that we were talking about, using local data to inform a self-reflection process that should inform LEAs, and they're going to report in conjunction with the LCAP. Local measures, on the other hand, are those tools or data sources from the school or district level that LEAs have always been encouraged to include as measurable outcomes in their LCAP, or to use as part of their needs assessment for their SPSA. But this year, local measures take on even greater importance in the absence of some of the state indicators like the Smarter Balance Assessment or the English Learner Progress Indicator, the LP from the school dashboard. So you hear them tossed around a lot. Just to make a distinction, local indicators are required. Local measures, which have always been encouraged to be used, are even more important now. Next slide, please. So this is the timeline shared by the CDE in a recent webinar. As noted, it's February, so LEA should be establishing a plan for collecting evidence to inform local indicators. But keep in mind, you already have a lot of relevant data that you should be considering. For example, you should be considering the stakeholder feedback from families and staff that you collected during the process for developing the learning continuity plan last fall. This data should definitely be considered during the reflection process for priority 3 parent-family engagement. Right now, you should be considering the data or information that you already have that you can pull together for the self-reflection process. And then you should identify any gaps that might require new or additional data collection. Then between now and June, LEA should be evaluating the evidence to inform the LCAP. And this is an important point, so I want to reiterate it. The intention of moving the local indicator reporting to align it with the LCAP was so that it would inform the LCAP. This should not be seen as a separate process. Local indicators reflect progress on LCFF priority areas that are addressed by the LCAP. And some of the required metrics in the LCAP, will be used to inform the local indicators. So there's a little back and forth. And for instance, some of those measures that are selected to demonstrate access to a broad course of study, those are like we report out on AP enrollment or CTE completers. So some of these things would be really pertinent to state and federal program directors. By July, the LEA must present the local indicators to their governing board in a public meeting in conjunction with the LCAP. And a question that might arise to you isn't that the same board meeting at which you have to adopt your budget? And you'd be right. So this is something we think is worth considering. There is a lot of really important information being collected and reported in the local indicators. And if you want to share that in a meaningful way with your governing board, it's going to take a while. So it might be worth considering how you might be able to provide your board with the information collected in the local indicators in earlier communications with your board, either through an information item or a study session, perhaps Friday memos, so that when it's formally shared at the LCAP adoption board meeting, they'll have had the time to digest the information and give it some consideration. And then the final step, which comes after in the fall, after the board has approved the local indicators, or they're not approved, but they've been presented, is that the designated dashboard coordinator will upload those local indicators to the school dashboard. Next slide, please. So here's a table of what the local indicators include. I've included just a quick summary that includes the performance indicator the LEA will be completing to demonstrate progress on the priority areas. For priority 1, the LEA measures its progress in meeting the Williams settlement requirements at 100% of its school site. This includes appropriately assigned teachers, access to standards line textbooks, and facilities that are safe, clean, and functional. The performance indicator for this priority area are the data that are included in the SARC already. So if you're at a district, then it's going to be aggregated to the LEA level, but it's the same information. Priority 2, the implementation of state academic standards. This can be demonstrated in one of 2 ways, either through a narrative summary or through the state-approved self-reflection tool. And the self-reflection tools provide questions at a 5-point rating scale, so LEAs can identify their progress in relation to the data that they're collecting for analysis. Priority 3, which is parent and family engagement, this was recently revised. It's the new tool that was revised in the fall of 2019 after significant input from family engagement experts and advocacy groups. So this gives you an option, or it doesn't give you an option, sorry. It requires the LEAs to use data to inform the self-reflection process in 3 important areas for family engagement. And since this reflection tool has not yet been used by LEAs, we would strongly recommend you take some time to become familiar with it, so you make sure you gather the right data to inform it. Priority 6 is school climate, and this requires LEAs to write a narrative summary of the results of a local climate survey, such as the California Healthy Kids Survey. And the survey must be administered at least every other year to 1 grade in each of the primary grade spans served by the district, so K-5, 6, 8, 9 through 12. And this survey should reflect students' perceptions of school safety and connectedness. And finally, there's priority 7, which is access to a broad course of study. This asks LEAs to write a narrative summary that addresses what data the LEAs use to measure access across the grade span served and the extent to which all students have access, any barriers to that access, and any actions that the LEA has taken or will take to address barriers. And note there are 2 additional areas for county offices I didn't include here. Next slide, please. So what type of data should an LEA be using to complete the local indicators? Although the evidence an LEA uses to inform the local indicators using the self-reflection tools is locally determined, the data really must be sufficient to measure an LEA's progress. And given the scope of the local indicators, it's important that this process is approached with a team structure to ensure that the right people are involved and that the most relevant data is being collected, hence why we think it's important to you. Those responsible for identifying who should be contributing and what evidence should be collected for the local indicators should become very familiar with the self-reflection tools to be certain that they understand their scope. Some examples of data that can be used: there's available state data. Not all of the data from last year is unavailable. So there are a lot of measures that can be collected through DataQuest or CalPAD, such as graduation rate, CTE completion, attendance. Also data available at the LEA and school level. This includes the Williams data, but it could also include grade span specific evidence of access to a broad course of study. So if you have in a high school district or a unified school district, any of that school level data that can be collected. And finally, stakeholder input, such as that collected through surveys, focus groups, or any other communication tools the district uses that can provide data. This could be either quantitative or qualitative, that would be used then to inform the survey process. Next slide, please. There is an expectation, as noted, that the LCAP will be used to inform the local indicators will be used to inform the LCAP. So in addition to the timeline change, the 2021 through 24 LCAP template instructions actually prompt LEAs to consider their analysis of local data and what they learn from the self-reflection process when they're writing the LCAP. So the local indicators are actually explicitly referenced in the instructions in several sections, including the plan summary and the goals and actions section, where LEAs are asked to consider local indicators when identifying their prioritized needs, and also within the metrics section. In that section, LEAs are encouraged to use metrics based on or reported through the relevant self-reflection tool for local indicators within the dashboards. It's pretty explicit how it can be incorporated there. Next slide, please. So an important consideration in your planning, and I think a real big part of where state and federal programs folks can come into play here is how do you avoid duplicating effort? LEA should identify during the planning process. So right now, the data sources that can be used to inform more than one plan or process. So as you identify data, measures and tools to track progress on the local indicators, consider how you can incorporate evaluation of the local indicator data into the work of analyzing and planning for other things like the SPSA, for example. So some of the data that's already being collected and reported at the LEA level, the school level, and through stakeholders comes into play here. As a state and federal programs person, I would encourage you to consider how the data that is being used for the comprehensive needs assessment for school-wide programs, for example, can also be used as a source for informing the LEA's local indicators. And also, reverse that. How can the information that's being collected for the local indicators be used at the school site for the school level needs assessment? Next slide, please. Just a couple of additional considerations here, just some things as you dig in you might notice. First of all, for priority one, the teacher assignment data, this should reflect the updated definitions for ESSA for reporting misassignments. This is the new definitions for ineffective and out-of-field teachers. Remember that the dashboard, the LCAP and other tools are actually used to meet federal requirements for reporting. So the state standards, the CTC assignment monitoring standards, are actually a little bit easier. So local decision, local assignments, and some permits and waivers are considered legal, but they don't meet the criteria for teacher assignment monitoring. Your HR people will hopefully know these distinctions, but just in case, you want to make sure that you're familiar with those as well. Priority three, I just noticed this digging in. When you're collecting data for the parent-family engagement self-reflection tool, you want to ensure there's a specific measure that's aligned with it. We have an explicit requirement for the LCAP, which is parent participation in programs for unduplicated pupils. So the self-reflection questions don't really ask that specifically. They ask for kind of murkier, like underrepresented students. So you want to make sure that you can kind of disaggregate that data, or you have questions that will get to that information. So you won't get to the end of the local indicator and realize, oh, we don't have the actual metric for the LCAP. So just be aware of that. Next slide, please. So finally, wrapping up, there's more information available on the CDE website. I actually have uploaded the local performance quick guide to our LCAP, or sorry, state and federal programs page for today, but there is additional information, including previous webinars and resource guides that are available at the CDE website for the local indicators. So I'm going to hand it off now to Jeannie for the LCAP update.
Okay, great. Hello, everybody. I just want to tell you we might go a few minutes over. I know our end time is 11:30, so our training will be recorded if you need to catch the later end, and I will try to go quickly. So with that, let's do the LCAP update, and if you'd go to the next slide, please. Here I wanted to remind you about 2 workshops we're providing this year for LEA teams, and these workshops are to support the LCAP process this year. And the first workshop was held this month. There's a recording available for it, and this really addressed the basics for the new LCAP training. And I will provide some overview, high-level highlights from that training today. But you can see where you can access those resources. And the second workshop is a meaningful LCAP for challenging times. If you haven't signed up, the link to register is included on the slide. And here, this is, you can see the three key components of really making this a meaningful LCAP to address this unique period of time that we're in. And we'll be looking at some, providing some guidance about really providing clear actions that are comprehensible and can be evaluated for effectiveness, and then reviewing the requirement to increase or improve services for English learners, low income, and foster youth. Next slide, please. We've reached out to district teams, as we have in the past, by reaching out to our contact people in the district, of whom some of you are our LCAP contacts, and as well as connecting with your superintendent. And we've done this outreach either yesterday or today, or it will be occurring later on today, where we are offering some customized support for district teams. And we found it helpful over the years to support districts with this kind of outreach, in that it really assists them to have a common understanding of the LCAP requirements across program and fiscal, and how to support their process to coordinate all of those who are involved in the work of the LCAP. So we're offering the district team support, and we also are continuing to offer our pre-review process. And this year, we are, LEAs may submit their drafts for review. The draft for the annual update, which addresses the 2019-20 LCAP and the 2020-21 Learning Continuity Plan, that you may submit that in March, and we will provide written feedback, as well as the opportunity to discuss and meet with the team to address the feedback. And in April, LEAs may submit their draft LCAP for review and feedback. Next slide, please. In our training, the basics training, we reviewed the components that are included in the new local control and accountability plan template, and their related sections and the requirements. And you can see those related sections listed on the right-hand side of your slide. The components are listed in the order in which they're compiled in an LCAP. And required are all of these pieces to be included in the LCAP submission by July 1st. So that includes the budget overview for parents, the annual update addressing the 1920 LCAP and the current learning continuity plan, the 2021 LCAP template, including those required sections, and the corresponding expenditure table. Collectively, these components make up an LCAP. On the next slide, we also provided a reminder of the importance of the instructions that are included at the end of the LCAP template, the end of the annual update template, and these address what needs to be included in each of the suggestions, or in each of the sections, sorry. They're not suggestions. And there's a clear distinction that the prompts on the outward facing template provide only an overview of each section for the public, and they don't include the detailed level of information that is required to be in each component in the LCAP. So during the review of submitted LCAPs, county offices must determine if the LCAP adheres to the template by reviewing the plan and ensuring that the responses address what is required by the instructions for each section. So we provide this as a reminder. Next slide, please. We also took a close look in this training at the annual update to be included with this July's LCAP submission. And as you know, CDE developed a special bridge template for the annual update that addresses both the 2019-20 LCAP and the current continuity plan. And because of the suspension of the LCAP, the annual update was never completed to address what occurred and an analysis of the goals in the 1920 LCAP. So in this one-time template, there's an annual update section to address 2 plans and a section where they are both analyzed together to inform the development of the new LCAP. So this annual update is providing a process for continuous improvement that emphasizes and requires LEAs to use available state and/or local data and feedback from stakeholders, including parents, teachers, and staff, to analyze what worked and to identify their current needs that will inform the development of their LCAP. And throughout the sections for the annual update, LEAs are instructed to, and you see it listed on the slide, use available state and/or local data and feedback from stakeholders to inform the process for reflection and planning for the development of the upcoming LCAP. Next slide, please. This visual provides an overview of the annual update format that is unique to this LCAP cycle in that it's addressing 2 different plans from 2 different times. You can see the 3-part format for this one-time annual update. The pink section matches some elements and format of the 2019-20 LCAP. The green section matches the sections in the learning continuity plan, and the blue section addresses how the overall analysis of the 2 plans taken together has informed the development of the 21-22 LCAP for the upcoming year. During the training, we shared that you may be overwhelmed by the details in each part of the annual update sections and the specificity that's included in the instructions. And that is likely that it may be the case. At the same time, the key concept is to come back to this grounding visual to remind yourself that this annual update is a process to reflect on the 2 different plans and to support the LEA to use what they've learned in their community to inform what they plan to do in the upcoming LCAP to address local needs. Next slide, please. There are also instructions that are included for the new LCAP template. And the prompts in the LCAP template are required to be written in a way that's understandable and accessible to parents. And here we see that the instructions provide technical information to complete the template properly and to meet the criteria for adherence to the template. And it's really important to note that the clarity in the instructions for the new LCAP template provides the criteria for what must be addressed as LEAs tell their story in the LCAP template. It's essential that LEAs use these instructions proactively as they plan their process for LCAP development and adoption. In the introduction to the instructions, there are key changes that are framed for the new LCAP template. Here, the introduction identifies statutory changes made through AB 1840, which enhance transparency regarding expenditures on actions included in the LCAP, including actions that contribute to meeting the requirement to increase or improve services for foster youth, English learners, and low-income students. And also there's a format to streamline information within the LCAP to make the LCAP more accessible and comprehensible to stakeholders and the public. And these changes are important because they allow the public to see and stakeholders to understand the story that's being told in the LCAP, and to understand why and how the LEA and their stakeholders are determining whether their strategies are leading to improved opportunities and outcomes for students. Moving on to the next slide. We provided during the training an updated document called the Summary of Legal Requirements, which we provided previously. And this document has been updated to reflect statutory changes, including what is required per the instructions in the LCAP template. It's organized around the components that collectively make up an LCAP. And we use this as we're working with districts while we're providing feedback either in the pre-review or seeking clarification during the formal review. And you may find this a helpful resource as you are working with your teams and stakeholders. On the next slide, I wanted to share a visual that was provided during the training, and this highlights some of the key components required in the process for LCAP development. It's important to note how these components intentionally work together to inform the development of the annual LCAP process, and that stakeholder engagement occurs throughout the annual process. So as you are refining your timeline for LCAP development, we suggest that you be sure that you're including each of these components. And each of these were reviewed in more detail in the basics training and are also addressed in the summary of legal requirements. And as Evan shared with us today, keep in mind that the time frame spans from February to July. And the development is a process that informs the LCAP development, as we learned when we were listening to Evan discuss the local indicator process. Next slide, please. Additionally, our training included another resource that can support LEAs with their LCAP development. The screenshots display the 2021-22 timeline for the Learning Continuity Plan and LCAP process. This document is posted on our website, and the purpose of this document is to support LEAs to organize and map out an LCAP process that's efficient, meaningful, and aligned with the real work of the district. And in doing so, the result is that an LCAP will be straightforward and comprehensible for parents, stakeholders. It would be efficient for staff to complete, and it would meet all the requirements for approval. As you know, the LCAP process requires input and oversight that is distributed and coordinated across the program and fiscal departments in an LEA. And so this document provides some suggestions for coordinating and monitoring that work. The fall section addresses the work done to develop and implement the learning continuity plan. It includes how a component for how stakeholders were engaged and how the LEA sought input from the stakeholders and kept the board updated with the work along the way. The winter section focuses on coordinating the work and information LEAs need to complete the annual update and includes meaningfully engaging stakeholders in the process to understand what was implemented, how resources were used, and the impact of the work. And in this section, it includes that suggestion for LEAs to submit their annual update for pre-review in March. And the last section, which is the winter-spring section, focuses on developing the LCAP using available state and local data and input from stakeholders so that your LCAP will address state priorities for all students and will be responsive to the needs in your community. And the suggestion is included for pre-review of your draft LCAP in April. You will see in each section the inclusion of stakeholder engagement and the involvement of the local board. So this is a resource that we provide for you. On the next slide, we have an eLCAP update, and available now is our eLCAP for the 2021-22 LCAP template. Coming soon and very soon, the annual update for the 2019-20 LCAP and Learning Continuity Plan will be available. Also, we will be providing a training video for how to use the eLCAP system and for submission. And please be reminded that within 5 days following local adoption, all LEAs, including charters, will submit the LCAP to LACO via the eLCAP. And with that, that concludes the LCAP update. I apologize for going over. And I remind you that our next meeting will be held Thursday, March 25th at 10 a.m. We'll leave the chat open if you have additional questions. And you also know how to reach us at the contact information included on the slide. And with that, have a great rest of your day. Take care.